You're all here and most welcome. So let's go in and do this presentation. So welcome everybody to this little attic room here in Rosscarbery. Rosscarbery, in case people don't know, is on the Wild Atlantic Way, and as you're cyclists, that should be something you should Google or check out, because it's 2,500 kilometres from Kinsale all the way up to Donegal or Derry, or if you're coming from the north, from Derry all the way down here, and we're right on the edge of the Wild Atlantic Way. So if you're a cyclist, check that out. I've done it a few times and it's certainly worth. In fact, as you can see, or maybe you can see, it's blue sky outside. It would be wonderful to be on a bike today, but I'm stuck in here to do this presentation. Very happy to do so for the cycling festival. Before I do, and as we're talking about cycling, I just want to read a short paragraph which might put us in the mood for what the title of the presentation is. I just read this from the book Quandam, page 36, and it just describes a couple of cyclists in a room. It happens to be in Aswan in Egypt, from different countries, and we're just chilling out and we're just discussing what it is like to cycle long distances. So just a short paragraph to set us all in the mood. Stretched on the beds we debriefed like soldiers after battle, and like soldiers we shared our stories, knowing only we could understand. Our journeys needed release. Each of us knew how the experience of cycling was altogether different to that of any other mode of travel. Only those who chose to walk long distance could nod the head in mutual appreciation. We agreed that a cyclist could only go so far in the sharing of experience with those who take buses, trucks, jeeps, cars, motorbikes. The intensity of being on the road, riding day after day, week after week, month after month, is different. And to get to some dreamed of distant place by one's own effort is more than mental satisfaction. It's a muscle and sinew knowing. Every metre is fairly and squarely met with, even directly gazed upon, and many are remembered intimately. The slow pace allows more to be seen, to be felt, to be absorbed. For the absence of speed means the absence of a kind of protective barrier to the extraordinary detail which one is open to when moving at 10, 15 or 20 kilometres per hour. Yet this is but the half of it. The flip side is the ease of going within, cocooned in the slow meditative rhythm of steady movement. There, a parallel is formed for the future, out of a billion bits of the seen and unseen stuff of one's passing. So a short paragraph to get us, as I say, in the mood of where I'm coming from, and that is, the last sentence says it, a parallel is formed for the future, for the future, out of a billion bits of the seen and unseen stuff of one's passing. Cycling long distance does that. It brings you intimately into, as we know, into the small detail of places. And by the way, I'm not talking here about a long journey. I read some months ago about a bunch of guys who, 6 or 7 or 8 of them, who did a long trip. That's different. Or if you buy a ticket and you take a truck from London to Cape Town, that's different. You're in a bubble. What I'm really talking about are those girls and guys who go solo, usually, best, and go for a long distance, long enough to have that, hopefully, and maybe, become a seminal experience. The title of the presentation was the aftermath is troubling, and the aftermath is troubling. And these are not my words, these are words that I took from a letter from Ted Simon. Though he's not a cyclist, I'm sure most of you will know who Ted Simon is. He used a motorbike for 4 years. And when I came back from my own trip, I wrote a letter to Ted many years ago, and I received a letter in reply, and ever since we're in touch. In fact, I spent a week in his home in the south of France just 3 weeks ago. So we have had long chats, and I want to read a paragraph from his letter, which is sort of relevant. Dear John, your letter took forever to reach me. It took long enough just leaving you, I see. And I've been slow to get to it because I saw it would be a long read. Now, having got to the end, I see that it's too late to make the connection a physical one. And I'll jump to the important paragraph here. We have both been somewhere quite rare, and the aftermath is troubling. There is no packet of wisdom to be brought back from that place. We got there by dint of extraordinary and somewhat artificial means, which cannot be sustained, and perhaps we will spend the rest of our lives looking for a way back in this more mundane, natural existence. I think what Ted was referring to here by, and the aftermath is troubling, because he experienced it himself, having spent 4 years on a Triumph. I think it was the last Triumph out of the Triumph factory in Coventry, if I'm not mistaken. But he knew that when he came back for 4 years, he found it extraordinarily difficult to settle into the routine of normal life, as I did. And I count myself lucky because I know Ted and I know Dervla Murphy as a friend, and I spoke to Dervla this morning, telling her I was making this presentation, asking her, well, I didn't ask her, but I wanted to, could she make any suggestions for the presentation, but you don't get much out of Dervla. And she said, well, get on with it, she said. But to be able to talk to Dervla and Ted, and I've a neighbour not too far away, Tim Severin, who did that famous Brendan voyage. These are veterans of the travel game, and they know very intimately what it's like to come back from big trips and to try and reintegrate. In Ted's case, he ended up starting an organic farm in California for 40 years. And that was my own case too. I wasn't following him. In fact, I was completely unaware. But it does point to, when you come back, your mind has opened, and you need to put that much bigger, wider experience into a box that you can live with. In Dervla's case, she just went back on the road, and she is open in saying that she just continued travelling. She made that seminal trip by bicycle in 1963 from Ireland, from Lismore to New Delhi. And that changed the course of her life, and she went on, as most of you will know, to write many books and go on many trips, long and short. And at 89, in fact, she's the same age as Ted Simon. They were both born in 1931. I'd love to get them to meet sometime, but that's another story. So I'm lucky to have these people to thrash these ideas out with. And when I spoke to Dervla, she more or less said that travel for her was like an examination, and exams are topical at the moment with the COVID-19. People can't do their exams. I have a daughter who's 18 who should be doing the leaving certificate in June, but all of these exams are put on ice at the moment. But Dervla's point was that if you go on a long trip, it's really like an examination, even though you're not aware of it at the time. But when you come back, things come up for question. I mean, I was a biochemist working in the University Hospital in Cork, and I came back, and I don't want to say too much about this now because I'm pulling the rug from another piece which you'll see in a few moments, which details that. But you have to find your new way, in a way. And I love that Swiss travel writer Nicolas Bouvier, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He had a lovely, and if I can paraphrase it, a lovely few lines where he he says, you think you're making a journey until you discover that perhaps the journey is making you. And then time moves on, you come home, you put your life back together again, and then you realize that maybe the journey has unmade you. So you're going from making the journey to the journey making you, and then the journey actually unmaking you. And I think what Nicolas Bouvier meant by that was that things are not the same. You can't get back into the old box or wear the same shoes. In my case, it was wearing the same white coat in the laboratory. Things don't fit as they once did after a trip. And that's how it should be. It's fine, and again, I spoke to Dervla, not just today, but several months ago about this, and she said it is different today because we have phones, we have technology, we have... I spoke to a young man who from this area in West Cork who was cycling on a similar route to Dervla Murphy to New Delhi from West Cork, and his dad wanted him to do the trip with the minimal technology. So we met for a coffee in the local town, and he put his phone on the table, and I asked why he was making the trip, and he said he wanted to be challenged and he wanted to experience himself. He wanted to experience maybe when the shit hit the fan, what he was going to do, how he was going to cope, test his mind, and all of these things that are very laudable. And I looked at his phone. I said, well, do you think you might not take the phone or your laptop or iPad, I think was what he was going to take. And of course, his dad laughed and he looked at me as if I had two heads. And his point was, well, of course I need the technology. And of course, I'm not against technology, but sometimes there's a conflict because often people want to go to experience something more about themselves and about the journey. But obviously, if you're able to Skype your girlfriend every night, or when, as I say, the shit hits the fan and you get lonely or depressed, and you can phone your mother or talk to your editor or whatever, you know, that takes from that hardcore experience which Ted Simon and Dervla Murphy, and I was lucky enough to experience that too, before technology. You really had to dig deep and pull up something deep from within yourself to cope with all of that. So, but I'm sure there are ways of dealing with that today. And I just want to go on, if I may, and read another piece from Quandam. And Quandam, by the way, means a period of time that has passed. So it's a period of time that is over. So Quandam travels in a once world. That once world, as I said, with modern technology, that world I'm describing is more or less gone. Well, it is gone, you know. But I want to give you just a flavour of this story and how it pertains to the thought of returning home from something. I'm writing here about being in the Congo, of meeting a guy originally from Iran, who is a refugee in the Congo, having left Uganda to become a refugee in the Congo. This was in the mid-80s. So we are chatting about things there, and this is what he says. By afternoon, we reached the Catholic mission in Aru, where we holed up for a second night amid so many refugees from so many places that my grasp on what I had imagined Africa to be began to crumble. But I am refugee too, said Fami. My parents came to Uganda from Iran a long time ago. I was born there, but had to flee when Idi Amin went too crazy. Now I and my brother share this truck to survive. I drive from Bunia to Buze and back again. I take whatever needs to go. Sugar, coffee, plantain, generators, fuel, timber, people. And yes, I have taken the animals too. For 6 years, up and down through this madness, I want to go home. I want to go home to Arua, but it's my way now. What else can I do? My whole family are strung out along the road from Butembo to Aru, but we are the lucky ones. We had money to begin. Most you see here have nothing but a bag of rags. Where will they go? What will they do? Some are better off dead, and don't ask about the women and children. All I will say to you, my friends, it is more dangerous to be a woman here than to be a soldier. Do you understand? But how could you? Don't think about these things too much. You would only get upset. You are on your journeys. Enjoy and have a good time. And have a good time. Christ, after Fammy threw that grenade, I couldn't sleep, and used half the battery writing the diary. Fammy never meant it, but his throwaway comment put me more firmly in my place than anything else said along the way. I knew what he meant. His life had been torn apart, and he had escaped from frying pan to fire, from one dictator's chaos to another, to rebuild and make ends meet in a place as corrupt as hell. And as for the women and girls, as he said, they were being raped wholesale. And I would simply pass through, having my good old time. Of course, in reality, it was not the sweet and smooth good time a traveller dreams of, for there were days when... But then again, I knew what he meant. As for travel, what does it mean? That night I wrote in a vain though full-hearted attempt to purge confusion with words. Outside, I hear the close and distant sounds from the forest, the night calls from the canopy. It's very late or very early, and a little realization dawns, a little explanation why I travel, why perhaps we all travel in the end. I travel to be disturbed, to be shaken and woken from a kind of sleep, to be disturbed on the way to a mere taste of real freedom. In the beginning, in those first days through Ireland, Wales and onward, the rush of false freedom, of innocent freedom, swept all before it. Joyous and innocent, because the real travel still remained cocooned in the dream. Every kilometre from my father's house to Sudan was a beauteous warm-up, and if Egypt before it enmeshed me in humanity, Sudan followed with its very physical demands. But Zaire feels emotionally my boiling pot, and is shooting so many holes in my travel dream that it's deflating, thankfully, into the seedy state of raw realism. In our limited personal capsule time, we travel, and we do so within a cultural framework time infused with all that infuses the social history space of our era. We act and interpret, perceive, imagine and discuss, ceilinged by the roots of our own upbringing, our culture, and the multitudinous limits of being a human sand grain in an ocean of extraordinary, unknowable experiences. What can I do with what I am being offered? What do I do with this experience? Where do I put it? How will I tell it? Where will it take me? And it goes on. The reason I read this piece was that I remember that particular time in the Congo, and though it describes a very harsh place, a tough place, militias, civil war, a lot of terrible things happening, that is the type of thing that pushes you at times when you make a long journey into difficult places, and it forces you to really reflect on who you are. And when you come back, that is an example really of how challenging it can be to just come back. I remember my own returning to the laboratory, and I remember the first Monday morning. I won't say the guy's name because he'd remember it, but I remember walking into the laboratory, putting on my white coat, and my colleague saying, "Hi John, welcome back. Did you have a good holiday?" And of course he meant it. For him, I was just gone a little while, and it was just a long holiday. How could I possibly explain to him what I've just read? There's no way. So when you go on a long trip, sometimes you come back with stuff that is quite a challenge to, and you've got to find some way to do it. But that's why we travel. I'm going to stop reading and talking now because I've said enough. I hope I haven't bored you. But in preparation for this, I spoke to my wife and she said, well, why don't you put up the Nationwide piece? And what she meant by that was just before Christmas, last Christmas, on RTE, the national television station here in Ireland, there is a programme called Nationwide. And readers who read Quandam got onto them. It wasn't me, and they got onto them saying that the book deserved a wider readership. And the Nationwide people came here and they made a very professional piece documenting the backstory to the book and the backstory to the organic farm, because eventually I did leave the laboratory and that, I suppose, was one of the consequences of making a long trip. I had to refashion who I was and decided to spend the last 20 years on an organic farm. And I'm not the only one in doing that. And by the way, I'm not insinuating that anybody who goes on a long trip should come back and start an organic farm, but it's quite a good thing to do if you have nothing else to do. But Nationwide did this, so I'm going to stop here now, and you will seamlessly, I hope, slot into the Nationwide piece, and that will bring you to the end of this presentation. I hope it was of some benefit or of some interest. But I want to completely finish with a quote from my old, one of the great Irish writers, Samuel Beckett. And it's written up here. He says, "Perhaps my best years are gone, but I wouldn't want them back, not with the fire in me now. Perhaps my best years are gone, but I wouldn't want them back, not with the fire in me now." So that's of relevance to people of a certain age who are reflecting back on their cycling days, and but there's a lot more cycling days, and even better cycling the older you are, the older we get. I think we enjoy it even more. So thank you for listening. Enjoy the Nationwide piece, and maybe we'll meet someday. And if you're ever in this part of the world, the Wild Atlantic Way, give me a shout, and we have a spare room, and I'd be delighted to meet and talk some more. Thank you.
Good evening, you're very welcome to Nationwide. Later on in the programme, we'll be finding out about that Tipperary Schools food project. But our first story this evening takes us to County Cork to meet a man who 30 years ago left a full-time, permanent and pensionable job behind and took off on an adventure which at the time very few Irish people would have had the courage to undertake. That adventure took 2 years and changed the direction of John Devoy's life. We've been to Cork to meet the man and hear his story.
John Devoy has always had a sense of adventure, a need to explore new horizons. Today, at the age of 62, he lives on a 6-acre organic farm near Roscarbery in West Cork, along with his wife Sarah and 3 teenage children.
You could go mad and make a chutney or something.
Yeah, you could, yeah.
Whether to leave them or take them down.
Take out that side shoots.
But as a young boy, John had dreams of travelling much further afield. Born in 1957, John grew up in Whitegate, East Cork, close to the oil refinery where his father Thomas worked as a mechanic. When John was 9 years old, the international demand for engineers in a booming oil industry led to his father accepting a job in Libya.
A Pandora's box of history, eh? My father worked in Libya. He was there about 2 years. And I was a young 9-year-old. Lots of postcards came. all of that stuff that came back from Libya not just fed into a wanderlust, it gave me the confidence to do whatever I wanted to do.
In 1985, John decided to quit his job as a medical laboratory technician in Cork University Hospital to embark on his own journey of discovery. Looking for advice, he paid a visit to the pioneering travel writer Dervla Murphy, author of Full Tilt, an account of her trip by bicycle from Ireland to India in the 1960s.
We had a long conversation about travel, about adventure. I remember leaving, it was late and I was cycling back to Cork, and on the doorstep, as I left, she says, well, it's going to be a great adventure. You go out there and come back with a story to share.
So that's exactly what John did. Over the course of 24 months, he travelled from North Cape in Norway to Cape Town, South Africa. Just himself and a bicycle.
I've heard people describe, and it's common to say, we're going off-grid. I describe my adventure as pre-grid. There was no phones, there was no satellite navigation, there was no GPS, there was nothing.
It's now over 30 years since John completed his epic journey. But he's only recently published the first book of a planned trilogy telling the story. So why the wait?
I had to wait for years and to create some distance between the person who actually did the journey. I say, that was me, that was once upon a time. Now I understand what he did, and I can tell you the story.
It really needs to take its time. And working on a busy farm, day after day, 850 chickens, a few children being nurtured and grown along the way, it was a very, very busy space. Writing a book on top of all that, it was very, very challenging.
John finally got the push he needed when he was asked to prepare a talk about his travels to the Rosscarbery Historical Society.
Being approached by the Rosscarbery Historical Society really gave me it lit the fuse to writing the book. The more I read the letters, the more I read the diaries, the more I realised I'm ready now. Yeah, the back from Giora Biran, Haifa, Israel.
The talk was in 2012. It was 2016 when I found him starting the book. I called to his house one day to buy some groceries from the farm, and I found him hunched over the computer.
John's first book recounts a section of his journey between Cairo and Nairobi. It's called Quandam, Travels in a Once World.
Quandam means a period of time that has passed. To do that journey would be impossible today. And I recall describing in the book the journey across the Bayuda Desert, 300 kilometres, not very far from here to Dublin. But back then there was no road. It took me nearly 12 and a half days. You're literally dragging the bike through sand. So the physical journey is completely different. And these are the shorts I wore. These were bought in Amsterdam, in Holland, and they were proper cycling shorts. But by the time I got to Egypt, they began to fray. I had no choice but put patches in. And in Bunia, which is in the Ituri rainforest in the Congo, it was either get rid of it or do a big job. And the tailor in Bunia did this magnificent patch. So they each have memories.
Alone, John faced many challenges, including a hit and run in Egypt that damaged his bike and a bout of cerebral malaria in the Congo. But the hardest part of his journey came on his arrival in Nairobi, when John received a telegram from home. His father had died and been buried, and John hadn't known.
To hear about that at a point, in a potentially high point of John's journey, I can only imagine how crushing that would have been.
So I seriously asked myself, should I return home? The embassy staff gave me all the time to communicate with my family And I remember my youngest brother saying, "And come home for what? To stand by your dad's grave?" And he said, "And then what?"
He acknowledges it himself that these are the things that are part of the risks of taking these trips. And there is nothing you can do about it. You have to accept that. And I think that's the way he took it too.
The support from family and friends was, take the news, but continue.
After finally completing his travels, it was the return to Cork and his life as a medical laboratory technician that John was perhaps least prepared for.
Coming back is the hardest because you've exposed yourself to so much experience, to so much life. It is like taking 10 years of life, normal life, and squeezing it down into 2. It's very hard to slot back into a 9 to 5.
To say it's a culture shock is an understatement, and to fit back in with work colleagues who perhaps had a whole different perspective on their life, whole different set of values, that's extremely challenging.
In 1990, John met Sarah while she was studying for a master's degree. 4 years later, they got married and started a family. But he became increasingly restless in his old job. His travels had given him a different mindset. John had a desire to work outdoors, to engage with nature, and to do something that contributed to a community. So, in 1999, he resigned from his job, sold his house, and decided to take on the new challenge of starting an organic farm. John and Sarah put everything they had into their new adventure. A massive risk for a couple with a young family.
It was a huge challenge because my wife has no farming background, so we were going into this organic farming decision. If I use the word green, we were really green.
It was absolutely extraordinary, the challenges we faced. This was a greenfield site. We had to put in our water, our electricity. We often compared ourselves with the Flintstones. We were down there digging holes, trying to plant 500 apple trees, thinking we were doing amazing, and then they didn't work.
It was a big challenge to set up that farm. John really had to start and learn everything from scratch, but that's in the nature of the chap. He is a very adventurous person, and he applies himself with terrific force to these things.
Despite many setbacks, John and Sarah were determined to pursue an environmentally friendly approach to farming and the planet. Eventually, their perseverance paid off. The farm began to thrive, and their organic produce became a fixture in local markets, shops, and restaurants.
The reason it is here, I believe, was because I more or less took the energy of the journey and I used that energy, that relentless determination, to create it. I said, right, if I can travel and cycle to South Africa, I can start a farm.
With his children now almost grown up, John has decided to lease the farm in order to devote more time to his writing.
Life moves on. I'm 62. I've written 1 book. The biggest job at hand at the moment is the writing of the sequel.
I feel the process of writing for John is an absolute extraordinary journey. It's such an affirming, incredible thing to do.
And after taking so long for John's first book, when can we expect his second?
My apologies to all of those who had to wait 30 years for the first book, but I promise it will not be 30 years. It will be far, far less than that.